The Dunning-Kruger-Effect. The feeling you get when you mix looking at a picture of Diane Kruger and absolutely have your brain melt, together with feeling as smart as John Ray Dunning, everyone's favorite nuclear physicist from the 20th century. Now, have you ever sat down at a table? Yes! Seeing yourself enjoy the company of the dumbest guy far and wide that would just not stop sharing his opinions. Shut up, Brian! Nobody cares about your opinion! Turns out this effect actually has a name. The Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a type of cognitive bias whereby less skilled people tend to overestimate the level to which they possess the skill in question to a degree greater than the people with more substantial levels of the skill. AKA, stupid people think they're smart. It's a phenomenon first described by the social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in a 1999 study, unskilled and unaware of it. They came up with this graph, describing how the perception of one's performance would develop as people's performance increased. As you can see, if you know nothing about a topic, you are aware of it, especially on difficult tasks. Few people would say that they are ready to perform open heart surgery on a friend. But once you get just a tiny bit of knowledge, you start to get what Dunning and Kruger would call reach-around knowledge. It's when people cobble together enough apparent information to form an impression. But once you gather more and more information, you become aware of all the things that you don't know. Your own evaluation of your performance decreases. Up until finally you actually develop some level of skill and rightfully claim to be a master at what you do. This effect can nicely be illustrated by the effect of the unknown unknowns. There's what you know, there's what you don't know, and there is what you don't know you don't know. When you get into a new field, let's say you want to become a carpenter. At the start, the only tools you know are the hammer and the saw, and you consider yourself quite sufficient at using them. But once you get to know about grippers and measuring tapes and whatever the fuck that is, you realize that maybe you're not that much of a hero anyway. You judge your performance by the relation of what you know and what you don't know. In the beginning, even though your absolute knowledge expands, the knowledge of what you don't know grows faster, which can explain the initial drop in the curve. The fancy term to describe this is metacognition. Cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing. Basically, the ability to rate your own performance. When you hear this, you might accept it and say, well, I'll just be a bit more careful in the future to rate my performance more accurately. Well, it turns out it's actually not that easy. Oftentimes, the skill you need to execute this metacognitive task of judging the performance are precisely the same as those necessary for the task itself. Do you need to judge whether you have written a grammatically correct sentence? Well, the act of judgment relies on the same set of skills as the act of forming a grammatically correct sentence in the first place. Do you want to know if one has constructed a logically sound argument? The act of evaluation depends on the exact same know-how needed to construct a sound argument. But that's not always the case. In one illustrative study, college football players did not differ from their coaches in how they evaluated their strength and speed. Probably because the manner in which you evaluate those qualities were not the same as the qualities you need to produce strength and speed. However, when it came to traits in which one could argue that the same skills were needed to produce and evaluate, such as mental toughness, coordination, players tended to rate themselves more favorably than did their coaches. You hear that recognizing is the first step towards improvement. But is that actually true? Dunning and others have shown that once poor performers are educated out of their incompetence, they show ability and willingness to recognize the errors of their past ways. They asked participants to complete a number of logical reasoning tasks and found that the bottom performers grossly overestimated their performance, thinking that their score on the task lay in the 55th percentile when in fact they lay in the 12th. Basically, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Then they took roughly half of the participants and gave them a 20-minute training session on how to solve these tasks, and then asked them to re-rate how well they had done on the original task. As seen, participants in the bottom dramatically revised their self-judgments, and they rated their test performance 19 percentile points more harshly and their overall skill at logical reasoning 10 points more negatively. Ironically, the 20-minute lesson led them to be more, not less, skilled in logical reasoning. But with adequate intellectual resources in place, participants proved quite willing to rate themselves negatively when faced with a performance that was below par. The Dunning-Kruger-Effect is just a statistical hoax! There have been a number of critics regarding the validity of the Dunning-Kruger hypothesis, most prominently claiming that it's just a consequence of the better-than-average effect and regression toward the mean. The better-than-average effect is the phenomenon that when you ask people to rate how they do compared to others, you get an average rating that is, well, above average, with studies as extreme as having 42% of companies' employees rate themselves to be amongst the top 5. The regression to the mean is a bit more complicated, but first we have to remember that when you look at two variables in nature, they are never perfectly correlated. In our case, we look at the variables performance and perception of that performance. When performance is very low, the chance of the other variable, the perception, being above, meaning closer to the mean, is greater than it being even lower than the already low performance. So by that you would automatically get that people would rate themselves higher than their actual performance when they are already low. Dunning and Kruger are aware of these critics, but they think that just labeling this as a regression effect is not really explaining the phenomenon, but it is just relabeling, especially in terms of the above average effect. Why are perception and reality of the performance associated so imperfectly? This can at least partly be explained by the metacognitive bias discussed in the beginning. One partly fun, partly sad application of this is that people think vaccines cause autism. Would people that know the least on the topic be most convinced of their opinion? A 2018 study looked at exactly that, comparing people's knowledge with their self-assessed confidence. So let's have a look at the results, shall we? More than a third of the respondents in our sample thought that they knew as much or more than doctors, 36%, and scientists, 34%, about the causes of autism. Get the fuck out of here! What is wrong with people? You don't know more than doctors and scientists about science and medicine? Okay, let's move on. Our analysis indicates that this overconfidence is highest among those with low levels of knowledge about the causes of autism and those with high levels of misinformation. Overconfidence is also associated with increased support for the role that non-expert, for example celebrities, play in the policy-making process. That shit makes me lose faith in humanity. But there are certainly other factors in play as well. A 2001 Swiss study looked at the psychological factors of climate change denial and found that the denials are therapeutic strategies to deal with the pain involved in dissonance. They are not easily set aside unless the perception of gains and losses is substantially reversed. So what they are saying is that accepting that climate change is real would lead to having to take certain measures, and people don't want to do that, so it's a lot easier to just dismiss it. Personally, I would also argue that on complex issues such as climate change, it is easier to inform yourself for a long time and still not get to the bottom of it, aka still not agreeing with 99% of scientists. Because there is so much information that has to be interpreted in the context and with a degree of subtlety which is just not that easy to achieve. This would work as a further moderator that will draw a different picture than suggested by the Dunning-Kruger effect, because we have this additional factor. Finally, let's look at what individual, personal traits could have an influence on your ignorance. Ignoring the fact and just keep preaching whatever you believe. To be sure, there is such a thing as general intelligence, but much research shows that people's performance on intellectual tasks can vary greatly from setting to setting. Obviously, you are not an expert on every single topic. You can be smart, but still know very little in certain areas. Literacy has been shown to influence how people perform in a wide variety of settings, from health behavior to job settings to financial decision-making. Its close cousin, numeracy, or the ability to reason with numbers and mathematical concepts, has been similarly linked to health and economic outcomes. it might be the case that those who are less literate or numerate will suffer not only from the lack of skill, but also from not knowing that there is information they need to seek out. Other potential characteristics preventing people from recognizing their incompetence may be more motivational in nature, centering on people's tendency to defend their sense of self-worth. People prone to defensiveness will claim harder to be right than less defensive people, regardless of their degree of knowledge. Last but not least, let's pay credit where credit is due, obviously to Dunning and Kruger, especially to Dunning, who has written a paper in 2011 for Advances in Experimental Social Psychology, where he reviewed his initial statements from 1999 and where I got a lot of the ideas for this video from. So personally, I think humility really goes a long way, and just knowing that ignorance is a double trouble insofar that it does not only hinder your performance but also your perception thereof. So I think it helped me to remind myself to approach the world with an open mind and know that I probably don't know all that much, especially when I'm overconfident in a topic where I have not put in the effort. So do you ever feel overly confident? I know for a fact that your annoying friend does. Let me know in the comments down below. And if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I will see you next time on Think It Through.